Hakeem walked in shackles, barefoot in shackles. And that went around the world. That had a big impact. If I mess this up, and I'm just making it up as I go along, and this kid gets killed, well, people are going to point the finger at me. The one thing he had in his favour, and in the end, the thing that saved his life was that he played sport.
Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with Craig Foster, former Socceroo, Logie Award winner, but more importantly, a human rights activist. Craig, welcome back.
Yeah, great to speak with you.
We left part 1, we're talking about the arrest of Hakeem, who had come from Bahrain, was a refugee, sought asylum over here in Australia. On his honeymoon, he went to Thailand from Australia. When he landed in Thailand, he was arrested by virtue of a red notice issued from Bahrain. Can you take it up from there?
Yeah, so all of a sudden he was thrown into like what we would call immigration detention, which is usually near the airport. People who have arrived without a visa or whatever the case is. He was thrown straight in there with his wife, and within 4 or 5 days they actually put him in prison, with what you would call hardened criminals, I guess, right? In that interim period, I hadn't heard about it, but what he did, thankfully, was he contacted his club in Melbourne. They started to call around...
his football club.
Yeah, Pascoe Vale. And they didn't know what to do, so they also called the Players' Union, of which I'm a former chair. And he started to share some videos. He shared a video and photos of himself in that detention in this little tiny cell, saying, listen, Bahrain want me back, I'm going to be killed.
Yeah.
And someone in football then came to me and said, listen, have you heard about this case? I said, no, what are you talking about? And they said, oh, well, this kid's in jail. He's a footballer, so you should be aware of it. He's also a refugee. I thought, oh, God, what's going on? And so I then started to look at it.
Yeah.
I looked at his case, I got hold of his court documents because it had said that actually he'd been not only charged but convicted on a 10-year sentence for something that had a fire that was set at a police station in Bahrain.
So they'd already convicted him.
They convicted him, which is why is why he'd run and he'd fled.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, hang on, what is this kid? Is this kid a criminal? Australia has granted him refugee protection.
Yeah.
Now that's a very high bar, extremely high bar. Particularly in Australia, where we've been in terms of refugees and our attacks on them, basically. So therefore, the Australian government would have known about that conviction, of course, as part of his case, and they have obviously resolved that it's not real and that it was improper in order for him to be granted protection. So I got hold of the court documents, I read everything I could about him, and I said, oh, this kid's in a lot of trouble for a number of reasons. Firstly, because if you go back to Bahrain, you're probably going to be killed. Secondly, because football had an obligation to help him, but he was not only in a legal web, and these are two royal families, the Bahrain royal family, and of course there is a royal family in Thailand.
Yeah.
And so the king in Thailand is hugely influential, and we had a military junta in charge, not a democratic government. And therefore, it was clear there was something between the two royal families. So the Bahrainis were clearly asking the King of Thailand to do something.
Yep.
And so I needed to get to the bottom of that. And of course, football, I looked at the game, it's the biggest game in the world. What are they going to do? Well, the head of Asia football, the president, is a member of the Bahrain royal family.
Right. Okay. That's good. Okay.
So he's a cousin of the family.
Yeah.
And he's been, so part of their soft power around the world is to position some of their people in sport. And therefore, he wasn't going to say anything. That gentleman, Sheikh Salman, his name is, he actually was also at the time and is still today the vice president of FIFA.
Right, okay.
So in other words, FIFA aren't going to do anything. AFC aren't going to do anything. Australian football, our own federation, is part of Asia, that confederation, so they're not going to do anything. So no one's going to do anything for this kid. The other thing was he was a Muslim kid and he was a refugee, and they are two things that in the last 20 years Australia's been very challenged by.
100%. And I'm just on that, just a segue short on it, that because we don't identify, like the white Australian doesn't identify with a Muslim, a refugee, that's happening to someone else. If it was someone that we could identify with, it would be a completely different story. So I could see how the point you're making, it can slip through the cracks
Totally.
because no one cares.
No one was going to help him.
Yeah.
The one thing he had in his favour, and in the end, the thing that saved his life was that he played sport.
Yep.
And in particular that he played football.
Yeah.
But the fact that he played sport connected him to broader Australia. So it allowed all of us, and obviously this is what my campaign was about, but it allowed every Australian to see him just that little bit differently.
Well, you're quite right, and I think how I took it on board, it was a football player.
That's right.
Yeah, and
Exactly.
that was the thing that resonated with me.
just
That's
totally
why I
right.
remember it. It was a football player.
Exactly. So, because we love sport so much in Australia, it was clear straight away that we needed to connect him through sport to Australians, and therefore, the Matildas and the Socceroos, and through our players' union, we started to get all the players on board, and then the fans, and all of a sudden, Australian football started to protest, Save Hakeem at the games.
Yeah.
And, and I would be sharing all that stuff. But essentially what that did is we brought the sporting community in first. And what they could very easily say is, this kid is one of us.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter if he's a refugee or a Muslim, he plays football. So we all should stand up for him. That was the connecting force. And then we were able to bring in human rights organisations, people around the world, put pressure on FIFA, get the Australian government moving, and in the end, get him out. But people would rightly ask me, well, why did you fight for this guy when we've got all these other refugees in trouble?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, look, I'm happy to help all of them. But the difference in this case was that we could use his involvement in sport to connect Australia to him and get Australia to stand up and help him.
It was a good strategy to use and get people to sit up and take notice. There was a real time frame too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That there's a certain set period of time before he could have been deported.
Yeah, that's
and once he's over in Bahrain, you're
finished. Now
Yeah.
you're gone. So, that was at the very start. And I wasn't essentially a campaigner before, if you like, running a global campaign. I didn't know what I was doing. But the first thing I knew is I had to find out as much about his case as possible, and having a law degree was a big part of that, understanding the persecution that he'd suffered and understanding human rights framework. And the second was to work out what the hell was going on. So I went to see Amnesty here with his wife. His wife came to see me, and that was pretty key. And then we went to see Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, the two biggest. And we started to work together a bit and try and, share things and start to publicise his plight. But what became clear pretty quickly was that we didn't have enough facts on the case. So we knew there was an Interpol red notice, but you actually, under law of Thailand and everywhere else, Bahrain have to actually submit an extradition request.
Yeah.
And that is a very lengthy document which has to be translated into Thai, which is not an easy thing. And so I kept asking them, well, when is his court date? What is the time frame on this? How long do we have?
Yep.
How pressing is it? And no one knew. No one could tell me, even the big human rights organisations. So after about, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks, it ended up being 77 days in total. But and for a variety of reasons, I decided, look, you guys don't have enough information for me to be able to advocate properly. I need to go over to Bahrain. I need to go to Bangkok.
Yeah.
I need to go see this kid, and I need to go and see embassies and the Thai government. I need to work out what the timing is, what the facts are, and how we can actually help this kid.
Yeah. And so that's what you did. You went to.
Yeah, so it was a bit of a tough call.
Was the wife still over there in Thailand at that stage?
By this stage, she was back,
Right?
Because they transferred him to, just their prison in Bangkok. And therefore, she just came straight home because she didn't know if she was safe. So obviously here you have a kid who's in a third-party country. Yeah. He's given protection here, but he's now in Thailand. Bahrain want him.
Yeah.
They've got people in the country of Thailand. Yeah. So she's unsafe. She thinks she's just going to be grabbed.
Get back here.
Yeah. So she came back, and then, of course, now he doesn't have any income. Now she doesn't know what's going to happen with all of their bills. So, all of that's going behind the scenes.
There was, I saw a meeting that you had with, or you were talking about a meeting that you had with his wife, and you were very emotional about it on the documentary, the Defenders. Tell us about that, because I was watching that. I was getting emotional watching it. Yeah.
Well, I get emotional even when you talk about it. Like, it's just the only way I could explain it is this. I was trying to campaign for him and working out how to do it. Just sharing things, getting in the Australian media and saying, look, sport needs to help this kid. We got the Matildas to hold the banner, and we're just organising behind the scenes, clubs and fans and things. And she got in touch through a group in Melbourne and said, I want to come up and meet you, and then we'll go and see Amnesty and that. And I went to meet. She flew into Sydney, and I went down to Mascot and met her in a hotel down there. And effectively, it was the first time in my life where I'd sat in front of someone, a woman, a wife, whose husband was in danger of being killed any moment of any day, saw her emotion and had her ask me to help. Yeah. And she asked, and I said, I'm doing everything I can. I've spoken to the Australian government and I'm sharing all these things. And she just didn't stop. She kept asking me, are you going to really help my husband? And I knew what she was saying. She was saying, look, you can help or you can really help. Like, are you really going to do this? Like, what are you going to put on the line for this? It's easy to share a few things, but my husband's going to die. And, I walked out of that meeting and went, oh, my God. So I went home to my wife and said, look, I've got to go to Bangkok. That was the moment when I said, okay, we just need to go and do everything that I possibly can. And I don't have enough info here. I need to go. And at that time, our house was being surveilled. And, and we never found out, but we think that it was, some, I'd imagine, some agents or some people close to the Bahrain government. And we caught them several times outside, and we spoke to the police about it and this and that. And I was scheduled to go about 4 or 5 days later to Bangkok. So I had to decide, look, am I going to go?
Risky in itself.
Is my family going to be okay? I had a meeting with Amnesty, and they said, look, you could be arrested there because the Thai government are already aware of this. We're already very loud on social media, and it had gone around the world. So when you arrive, they know who you are. They don't like human rights organisations or advocates. We can't even have an office there as Amnesty, and therefore, it's a military junta. It's a general who runs the country.
Like you get arrested for criticising.
Get arrested. That's right. Well, and I didn't even know, but in Thailand, if you criticise royal family, they'll incarcerate you for up to 15 years just for criticism. And I'd already been critical before I'd left here, although I didn't understand yet quite what the king was doing. He actually was at the heart of it. So, and it was like, so we had to put our finances in order. We had to make a decision as a family. And thankfully, my extraordinary wife said, look, you just need to go. Because this kid was 25 and I was 50. This is 4 years ago. And I said to her, look, he's just married. We've got 3 beautiful children. We've had 2 or 3 careers. He deserves an opportunity to do what we've had. And whatever the consequences are for our career, I knew that I would have to leave SBS because I'd be criticising the Australian government. And they're a government broadcaster, so that's not going to work. So we knew that it was going to change our career, change our life, and I knew we might not be successful. I said to her, you do understand we might end up being the villains here, because if I mess this up, and I'm just making it up as I go along, and this kid gets killed, well, people are going to point the finger at me.
And it's uncharted territory.
It's uncharted territory, totally uncharted. So, but we just decided, look, we've had everything in life, and whatever we have to lose, we're prepared to lose. I said to her, look, we can go back up home and live in a caravan. I wouldn't give a stuff. Back up home in Lismore. As long as I understand that we've tried to do the right thing, I'm comfortable with that. I always have been. So let's go and let's try and get this kid.
So you're 100% in, and probably, and that the words of the wife would have been resonating in your mind the whole time too, I would think.
Well, Lara just said, look, I understand. I think you're right. You've got to do it. We've had an incredible life, and if it changes from here, and, in some respects goes downhill, it doesn't matter. We're together. We've got an amazing family. We both believe it's the right thing to do. Just go do it. So I flew over to Bangkok. We had people in the street watching the house. I had former detectives, friends of mine, who organised some assistance and took off. And so we had a plan to get out of Thailand if we were in trouble.
Yeah.
Amnesty had an escape plan, so we had to, carry passport and everything on us at all times. Just
Get to
so
the border quickly.
get to the border, get on a train, get out. And then we just put head down and went forward and said, okay, wherever this takes us, it takes us. And that I went to Bangkok, met him, went from there to Zurich, went and saw the UN, saw FIFA, and that's when it really all kicked off around the world.
And and because you had you had the platform to start that, so you could have knocked on the doors and got into places. It would have.
Well, I just forced my way in, and so I utilised the international network of Amnesty, for example. So through their networks in Bangkok, we were able to go and see the Swiss embassy, the German embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Belgian embassy, the EU embassy. In order to garner international support. And also in those meetings, I was asking them, what do you know about the case? Like, you're the diplomats. They're in touch with the Thai government. What are you hearing? What information do we need to understand? Can you help us? Are you going to support us? And of course, the most important thing was to go see Hakeem in prison. And that was, that was bloody traumatic. Just because to sit in front of the kid, that's another moment that changes everything, because, you just see, who is this kid? I don't know. I've never met him. And this kid comes out, he's emaciated. He's lost all the weight because he's sleeping on a concrete floor and he's so worried. He hasn't seen his wife for I don't know, like maybe 4 weeks or 3 weeks by the time. He doesn't even know where his wife is.
Uncertain future.
He knows he's going to die if he goes back. He knows what... crucially, he knew as a Bahraini what the Bahrain government was capable of. He knew that they would reach out their tentacles. He knew they would have people in Bangkok. Like, he was saying that to me. They're going to have people here. They're going to have misinformation in the media. They're saying I'm this and that. They're lying in the media because that's what they do. Bahrainis know what they're up against. So I saw him in prison and I showed him a letter from his wife. And I didn't know that she'd written in that letter, she asked, can you take this letter to him over there? Yeah. And the letter said, this is who this guy is. You never heard of him, but he's running this campaign. You can trust him. I trust him. And I didn't know what the contents were.
Okay, so that would have given him some comfort.
So that was important.
Yeah.
So she was clever doing that. But what I saw was, I held up a letter from his wife, and I just saw a kid that was just in absolute terror and didn't know where his wife was.
Yeah.
And his eyes, he just kind of reduced this kid to just like the basic aspects of humanity. I want to know where my wife is. I'm terrified for my life. Is she safe? And what's going to happen to me? And when you see humans in that place, it's very, very difficult. Very difficult, because you realise that, this is what has been done to him. He's just been reduced to, this terrified kid.
So from a personal perspective, your perspective, you've made that conscious decision. I'm going to do what it has to be done to help in whatever way I can. You've met his wife, you've met Hakeem, and you're getting a real sense of it, and you're embroiled in the whole thing. You're going around, you're knocking on doors, you're not taking no for an answer. Yep. Did you at any point think, yes, we're starting to get the ascendancy here?
Yes. But the problem was the Ministry of Bahrain, the government of Bahrain, they have a miscommunication ministry as well. Yeah. So they're very skilled at that.
Put out what they need.
Right.
To, yeah.
So it became clear when I was in Bangkok that they knew now that this campaign was going places. I'd been on CNN, I'd been on BBC. This was global news. Yeah. This was making them look bad. And so they started to issue statements in response, which... in some ways was positive, in other ways it was very worrying. And also because by that time I was being able to infiltrate, if you like, build a relationship with the Australian government, in particular Maurice Payne, our former foreign minister, and the ambassador in Thailand. By that time, I was getting access to information which was concerning. It was saying that they actually were expediting the case. So in other words, the better I was doing with the campaign, the faster they were going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Right, because they were also saying to Thailand, this is making you guys look bad. Just get this through the court. And so it got to a point where I was informed in Thailand by a diplomat, an Australian diplomat, that actually it was supposed to go to the foreign minister, and he was supposed to sign off, because this is an extradition of a person from another country, so it has international diplomacy implications. And so under Thai law, the foreign minister is supposed to sign off on it, yes or no.
Yep.
And in times in the past, those foreign ministers have said, no, we're not going to extradite this person because it will ruin it will damage our relationship with this country, Australia, or whoever else. And they came to me and said, listen, they've just skipped that. They've skipped that and they're rushing it through. So the kid could be gone. This was on a Friday night. They said he could be gone. It has to go into court, but so Monday morning he could be finished. And that's the time when I said, okay, I need to fly tomorrow to Zurich. I need to go and smash FIFA. So I got on a plane the next morning, flew directly to FIFA, and I sent a tweet out saying, I'll be there on Monday and we're going to have a meeting, or else I invite all the world's media and I'm going to tell them what's going on. So I just basically I just threatened them.
Yeah, what a pain in the ass you would have been for them.
Oh yeah, that's totally right.
Sometimes it's what you got to do, isn't it?
Well, I always say to people, it's very Australian. Like, we just gatecrashed FIFA. Like, who else in the world other than Aussies is going to gatecrash FIFA?
Yeah. You're not there to make friends. Yeah.
No.
And so it had the desired effect?
We got inside a room at FIFA. They tried to muck around a bit on the times and this and that. They played a lot of games. Having 20 years in the media, I understood those games. Was able to keep them in the gun, if you like, to pen a term from your old profession. And we ultimately got the meeting, got them in there. It was like a half-hour meeting. I think it ended up going hour and a half, 2 hours. At times it was heated. I was basically saying to them, look, you guys know what's going on, but I have some further information that you're not aware of, and this comes directly from my own government, and the information is 1, 2, and 3. They went out of the room to check that, to call some, FIFA, is able to access governments everywhere. They came back and said, yeah, okay, that's fine. We've corroborated that. I said, okay, so now you know that I have the trust of my embassy and my government as well. I'm not just here as a former player. And therefore, we need to work together because this information is not public yet, but it's going to be public in the next 20 minutes unless you do something. Yeah. That was effectively the meeting. Okay. They started yelling and carrying on and what have you. And, I had them in the vice. Yeah. And and they kept trying to get out, and we just kept bringing them in.
You had them jammed up for the skill set that you would have brought there, or you've got the football knowledge, so they can't dismiss you there. Oh, you don't understand. Well, you do understand. That's right. You got the law background. That's right. And you've got the media. And I suppose the other thing, that you had the Australian government by that time coming on board with you, so you could negate anything that they threw at you.
Totally right. Yeah. And so they knew I had the media skills as well to really, bring this out in a big, big way. And that would have rightly made them look very, very bad, so they weren't doing enough. And so the idea was, I said to them, you need to do 1, 2, and 3 right now. Yep. So we ended up agreeing on those things, and we issued a joint press release. So they issued a release some hours later saying we're working with Craig to bring this to a speedy end. And for the first time, they called on Bahrain to do something. Okay. Because don't forget, the royal member of Bahrain is the vice president of FIFA. So all FIFA had been doing is saying to little Thailand, who were just responding to Bahrain, saying to Thailand in 2 statements, oh, Thailand, you need to let them go. And they knew that wasn't the problem. The problem was the royals of Bahrain. But they were never going to call them out because of politics. And so I made them call Bahrain out in that press release. And that was a big change.
That changed it. And when did you find out that you had a victory?
So probably then I went back to Bahrain, because then they rushed him into court, and that was when he came in shackles in his second court appearance. In Bangkok, sorry. Bangkok, I went back to Bangkok. I came here and we were still protesting. Yep. And then there was further bad news that he was in court only a couple of days later. And I went over, and that's when I was in the basement of the court where they bring them in, and that's when Hakeem walked in shackles, barefoot and shackles. And that went around the world. That had a big impact. Yeah. That, the whole world said, how can you, this is feudal. This is hundreds of years ago. How can you have, and this kid is not a criminal. How can you, and even if they were, shackles in 2023. Yeah. And that embarrassed the Thai government. That just blew everything up. It just went, then social media everywhere. It was this is just disgraceful. So that was a key moment. And after some advocacy and all of those things, by that time the Australian government was doing a really great job. I came back to Australia, and then ultimately I got a call from the Foreign Minister's office to say, look, we think we're going to crack it in the next 72 hours. And 2 days later, he was out.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did it make you feel?
Well, I just relieved, that the pressure was off. I was probably involved about 70 days, I guess. I mean, he was or 75, I don't know. He was in a few days before I came across the story. But the tension of that is, it was just like extraordinary. You couldn't sleep. When someone's life is on the line, I'd never experienced it. I would be in bed with the mobile phone on my chest, with the vibrate on, and just because the campaign is global. So you've got to be on European time and US time and Australia. And so by that time, we'd all lost weight. We just we're just like, oh, man.
Yeah, that's a priority. You're giving everything to it. And that's and have you caught up with him? You would have caught up with him?
Yeah, so we keep in touch. We a lot of groups helped him to get employment after that. He's moved on. He has a young son now who's probably is now like almost 2 years old. Built a house and these things, is trying to rebuild his career. But the problem is this sort of trauma never leaves people. Yeah. So, it destroyed his football career. He was only 25. He's 29 now. So he was never able to achieve what he wanted. Because physically he could, took him a long, long time to recover. And emotionally, of course. There's impacts on his family, on his broader family back home. He can't travel back to Bahrain ever, so he can't see people. And, people need to understand that, campaigns like this have a start and end. Yeah. But the impacts of tyranny
flows.
It's lifelong. So his life has just fundamentally changed, and it's never going back to what it was.
What about yourself? Has it given you a rod for your back in that people are reaching out to you on these type of things? Has it changed?
Oh, yeah, it changed my life.
The direction of your life?
Yeah, totally. Changed it totally. I was heading in different directions. I was finishing the law degree. Yep. So, I was thinking about lawyer or even barrister of human rights, for example. And this just totally changed everything. Yeah. What it did do is brought my advocacy to the attention of Australia and allowed me then to move, because I segued from that immediately into the refugees offshore. Yes. And said, look, because that was that sport connection. And people would say, well, why this kid? And I'd say, well, because sport makes him look human. But there's all these other humans who don't have sport as protection who were doing the same thing too. And so I need to go help them. So I went and ran a big campaign to get everyone offshore. And and just kind of moved on.
There's quite a few things you've done, but you also, I think, when you were on the Hakeem situation, that it was getting thrown back at you. Don't you tell us about rights? Look what you're doing in your own country.
That's right.
Which is quite interesting, isn't it? And,
very interesting.
There was something that you said, and after Hakeem was released, that Australia needs to look back at how we treat every human being that comes out to these shores, irrespective of how they arrive. We're equal and should all be treated with equal dignity, care and respect. And Australia must do better than we have in recent years. Yeah. And that was sort of your statement. And I think you thanked Scott Morrison and the government because they got behind. They did. But there's also that part of it. We've got to look at ourselves.
Yeah, so as soon as he got out, he came back into Melbourne, and then I think that day or perhaps the next day, I put an open letter in the Sydney Morning Herald saying, listen, thanks to Australians, it's amazing what everyone did, but we all need to recognise that this kid is a refugee and we're torturing all these other refugees, and that's not consistent with our values, and also called on Scott Morrison, and then it was Bill Shorten, who was the opposition minister, to say we need to change this policy. And one of the reasons is, as you identified, throughout, I would go speak to other governments, and I went to the UN and spoke to the ILO and to the UN Refugee Agency and many organisations, and they would all say to me, listen, this is great, like we'd like to help, but you're asking us, you're Australian, and you're asking us to help one refugee. Look what you guys are doing to several thousand offshore. Yeah. And I would say to them, look, just I acknowledge that, and that needs to change. So just help us get this kid out. And I believe that because we've got huge goodwill in Australia, Australia's stepped forward for this kid now.
Yep.
And I'm going to try and transfer some of that goodwill across to other refugees and refugee policy and the issue itself, because we've been in a horrific place for the last 20 years. And that's what I did.
Well, it's an amazing story. You also got to deliver an address at the Centre of Sport and Human Rights Conference for the United Nations.
Yeah, that's right. We went with Hakeem,
Very powerful.
Yeah, so they were involved. So that's a Geneva Sport and Human Rights organisation who were very helpful in organising other governments to help diplomatically. Yeah. So what was important was when he went into court to have as many governments around the world sitting in that court to show Thailand that the world is condemning what you're doing.
Powerful message, isn't
and
it?
Also behind the scenes diplomatically, just in their, in their bilateral talks, to just raise it and say, look, we're aware of what's happening here. We don't think this is appropriate. We think Thailand should uphold the Refugee Convention, which I'm pretty sure they're not a signatory to, right? Yeah. So that was what all those discussions are about. And so in the end, they said, come over here to talk about the importance of the case. It's in terms of sport and human rights and the power of sport to help people and to uphold human rights. It's one of the most important cases, if not the most important, because it demonstrates that sport, athletes and sport itself is capable of stepping forward, and it also meant that FIFA were ultimately held accountable to their own policy.
Well, it has sort of set a precedence, hasn't it?
Yeah,
This is what can be done,
exactly,
and make us look at what sport is all about, and if the human rights have been breached with sport. Even though I think you touched on where the World Cup was held, what goes on in the World Cup, is that the place that should hold the World Cup if they're not they're in breach of human rights. So it goes right across the board, doesn't it? It's far-reaching.
Yeah. Well, what many of us believe, and certainly everyone involved in the campaign, is that sport has an obligation to not do harm. So that means not go to countries where playing sport allows that country to hide human rights abuse. And many Gulf countries are like that. Qatar for the World Cup, for example, there's over 6,000 migrant workers who died building the stadiums.
Yeah,
and they're never going to be compensated. And so it's wrong for sport to do that. And so we need to make sure they're accountable to not do that in future. But more than that, sport can actually then say, look, because it's so powerful, it can say to all these countries, we're happy for you to host a World Cup. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that you're not victimising or criminalising the basic rights of the people in your own country. And so therefore sport could easily say, look, just the most basic human rights need to be upheld, or you can't have a World Cup or an Olympics. That means women's rights, it means freedom of speech, that means non-discrimination on the grounds of religion, for example, right? Which would change Bahrain. All of these, just the most basics. Right? If sport did that, Saudi Arabia are saying, well, we want to invest in sport all around the world. We could easily be saying to Saudi Arabia, that's totally cool, we love that, but on this basis. You need to change just these fundamental things, okay? And if they're not consistent with your religion, well, then you need to think about that. Because, under human rights instruments, religions have a certain protection, but only to the extent of non-discrimination. So, if your religion might not believe in LGBTI, but the world believes that LGBTI have rights. Yeah. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you can't host any of our major tournaments, and that's just too bad.
I think it's a good idea, and I know there's the school of thought that politics and sport shouldn't mix, but I think we've evolved past that. We've got to look at the.
We just admitted now that it does.
Yeah, we've got to look at the bigger picture. There's so many other things that you've done, Craig, and we're running out of time. But you're the face of Amnesty Australia, are doing some good work there. Which is what are you pushing for? The campaign, that's right, for asylum seekers kept in detention by the Australian government.
Yeah.
New Zealand have offered to take them.
Yeah, so we got that across the line.
Yeah.
So last year in 2022, just before the election, and as part of their electioneering, the Morrison government accepted finally the offer after 7 years. So in other words, 8 years, but 8 years ago, Australia could have easily said from Manus and Nauru, yeah, you guys take 150 per year.
Yeah.
Yep. And so after just a few years, it would have all been over. People would have been, in safe environment. And Australia didn't accept that for political reasons and tried to pretend that, these people should still be, demonised. So all we did is, we campaigned to make sure the Australian government accepted that.
It was Sonny Bill Williams
Came with me, yeah.
Yeah,
he's a big refugee supporter, and rightly so.
Again, these high-profile sports people.
Yeah, they're great when they do it.
Doing things for
really
the betterment. So many other things that you've been involved in. What's this one? Craig, the advocacy for securing the evacuation and resettlement of 100 Afghans from Kabul.
Yeah, mostly women, yeah.
That was horrendous what happened there, and to be able to involve and help get people out. We had a guest on here that was over there at the time, and it was just horrific. But doing that type of stuff.
So these types of things now have come out of the Hakeem campaign.
Right.
So in other words, what happened there was people in Geneva who we'd worked together on the Hakeem campaign, then got in touch with me and said, listen, we've got these Afghan athletes, women, who are going to be killed, and we need a country to take them, and we worked with you on the Hakeem, we know each other, what do you think? And I said, I'll get Australia to take them. I'll call the foreign minister and I'll get some friendly MPs on board. So I called Zali Steggall, Nick McKim from the Greens, and Kurt Fernley, because there was a couple of Paralympians. And so we worked with some other Aussie lawyers and people around the world to get them out. We got them on the planes and they got out here. They're now playing actually in Melbourne for Melbourne Victory, which is wonderful.
What a great thing. Yeah. Well, I'm missing you on SBS with the football analysis, but I've got to say the work you're doing now is so important. Yeah. With the football, you're still involved?
Yeah, so I do the Champions League, which is the biggest cup competition in the world for Stan Australia.
Yep.
For Stan Sport, which is part of the Nine Entertainment Network. I enjoy that. That's my happy space. You know, so this stuff is a lot of... I'm also involved as the co-chair of the Australian Republic. That's also, whilst that's, if you would, that's about Australia's constitution being changed, so there's a political dimension. To me, it's and there's different views around it, but it's about in part it's about the royal family, but to me it's more about Australia's next step.
Yeah, the royal family's secondary to what
no one cares anymore, and it's about what do we look like, who are we, what does our multiculturalism mean, how are we reconciling with First Nations, and how are we all going to come together, unify, and walk forward as one country. Yeah, the Voice is about bringing Australia and First Nations together, and the Republic is about multiculturalism. It's about all the rest of us, built on that truth and justice and all of the values of contemporary Australia, saying, well, this is about us now. Again, it's time for us to stand on our own 2 feet. Let's go, right?
We'll get you in there stirring things up. I'm just trying to think, is there any other campaign I want to put you on? How... The Women's World Cup in Australia, how's that going to be received here? Do you think it'll open our eyes up to a lot of things?
Yeah, it's going to be just phenomenal. But, it also has this dimension. I was involved with the Human Rights Commission on a report into the areas where we're falling short on human rights. Yep. The reason we have to do these things is because FIFA actually have a human rights policy. Yep. So, some people would say, why is sport getting involved in this? The reason is because... when FIFA gave the World Cups to Qatar and Russia, that is very serious human rights impact. Like people actually die, right? So therefore, the game was forced to have a human rights policy and to consider the impacts of its big tournaments, right? So we did an impact statement on what this means, and that is very much about where we're falling short as a country. Some of that is about First Nations. Others are about migrant workers, because there is a lot of exploitation in Australia, particularly on plantations and fruit picking and all these things. And also particularly about freedom of speech. So the right to protest is under siege in Australia at the moment. South Australia just brought in laws, I think it's up to $50,000 or something for, certain types of protest.
That's always concerning if
right.
you shut that down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you were in Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
You understand that in a democracy, this is the point about Hakeem. So Hakeem went and protested peacefully in the street, and he was incarcerated and tortured. Okay, that's the extreme end of cracking down on protest. But Australia is now taking steps to criminalise, put people in jail, and disproportionate fines. And what that's about is governments don't want us to be raising various issues. Okay, and that's the reality. And therefore, we all have to push back against that. And anyone who watches the doco, the first thing you should be doing is saying, okay, I understand the power of protest, and that in Australia, even in a place here, it can be under siege.
Let's give a shout out to the documentary, because the defenders, and it's very powerful stuff, and it opens your eyes to a lot of things. As sitting down here discussing with you today, Craig, it's you've made me focus on things that I hadn't really looked at in the depth that you have. So keep up the good work. In finishing, I think a good way to finish is what you received your 2023 New South Wales Australian of the Year award for, and this is how it's been described. Former Socceroo turned human rights and anti-racism activist Craig Foster has become New South Wales Australian of the Year for 2023. Foster has been recognised as one of the country's most powerful voices for the disadvantaged and honoured for his award-winning career as a sports broadcaster and champion of active multiculturalism. That's really cool, Craig. You should be proud of that, mate. So, thanks so much for coming on to I Catch Killers, and I'm sure people are going to enjoy what you've said, and keep up the good work.
I hope so. Likewise to you. Well done.
Cheers.